And now the darkness will begin to gather ascendancy until the nadir point on the solstice in winter. As we contemplate the state of our world today on June 20th, I think there's one area that is of paramount importance because the consequences of what's going on in that region will shape the next phase of history and the moral framework in and through which humanity understands itself. And that's what's going on as we speak between Israel and the United States and Iran. It's very important for all of us to take in both the gravity of the crisis that we're in and also fundamentally that this is deja vu all over again. What happened in the Iraq War, that first Iraq War after 9/11, is what is repeating itself. I've been very attentive to the mainstream media over the last several weeks, just watching how the mainstream media has been mobilizing public opinion with the drumbeat of war. You remember in uh, the aftermath of 9/11 in 2001, there was a drumbeat of war against Saddam Hussein and Iraq at that time around weapons of mass destruction, even though, as it turned out, there were none. And the entire framework for the war was a deliberate falsehood perpetrated by the neocons in the United States who convinced President George Bush Jr. that they needed to do something in the aftermath of 9/11 to show American strength, and they picked Iraq. And those of you who remember that war will remember Condoleezza Rice and Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush and Colin Powell and the entire array of American officialdom supported by the press talked about not only weapons of mass destruction, but that Saddam Hussein was very close to a nuclear weapon. And you saw pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and if we don't stop him now, he could bomb New York or San Francisco. And even in the face of the largest protests in the history of the world, and that's also important to remember. There were protests around the United States and around the world with millions of people. My recollection is that the largest one was actually in London, where something like 2.5 million people came out. That did not alter the game plan. And the rest, as they say, is history. I want to note a couple of things about what's going on now in the media and among the officials of Israel and the UK and France and Germany, the United States, the same group of countries that motivated that attack on Iraq. Uh, First, that many of the experts that commented on Iraq are commenting now on Iran with the same rhetoric. I was watching Cooper Anderson last night, just spieling the rhetoric of war. if we don't take Iran now, they're going to get nuclear weapons and they will attack New York or Washington and destroy us all. Even Van Jones, who's a leading progressive figure in the Democratic Party and in the movement for social justice in the United States, was talking almost feverishly about, can you imagine if Iran had nuclear weapons? We have to stop him. And so you just see this gathering momentum to justify the Americans and the Israelis going in to Iran and really taking out not only those nuclear facilities that are on the verge of a nuclear weapon, but engaging in regime change to overthrow the government of Iran and install, as they've done to dozens of other countries, a regime friendly to the United States and to Israel as they pursue full spectrum dominance over the entire region. It's also important to note about Iran that over the last 10, 20 years, since the drumbeat against Iran has been mobilized largely by Israel and the neocons in the United States and in Europe, the intelligence agencies have said it's not true. As recently as this March, which is only 2 months ago, 3 months ago, Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, which is the agency in the United States that is mandated to organize and coordinate between all the intelligence agencies in the US government and in the US military, stated in Congress that there is no evidence to indicate that Iran is anywhere near nuclear weapons status. And when told about that several days ago, Donald Trump said, I don't care what she said. Iran has to completely eliminate its nuclear weapons reprocessing program and submit to unconditional surrender, as he put it. And we know where the Supreme Ayatollah Khomeini is, and we can take him out anytime. It's that mentality that I want to unpack during this program. And I want to begin with Benjamin Netanyahu and review the history of the last 30 years as it's been embodied by Benjamin Netanyahu, who currently is leading the charge against Iran. Even in the 1990s, Netanyahu, before he was even prime minister, has been warning about the imminent danger of an Iranian nuclear weapon. And it was Netanyahu in 1996 that urged the United States to cooperate with Israel to destabilize and overthrow the governments of 7 countries in the Middle East. Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. That became, because of the control that the Israeli government and the Zionist movement has over the United States, that became official U.S. policy. And this was during the Clinton administration, and every administration since then has sought to effectuate the policy formation originally and consistently enunciated by Benjamin Netanyahu since the 1990s. And if you look around the world today, you'll see, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, which was the triggering for this policy formation. Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, Somalia have all been essentially destroyed. One nation remains: Iran. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is this such a feverish obsession for the radical right in Israel and for the neocons in the United States? And the answer is complicated and very complex, but it's worth our spending a few minutes to understand what Iran represents and the history of Iran, and how it's now caught up in a drama as the principal country in the Middle East, and in fact, in the world, the only country in the world that has consistently stood against Israeli expansionism and the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. That's the ultimate reason why Israel and the United States are seeking to topple the Iranian leadership, using the pretext, as they did with Iraq 25 years ago, to attack a country that has been standing against Zionism and in active support of the Palestinians for the last 20 years. I want to restate that Iran is the only country in the world that has consistently stood against Israel and supported groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and others, the Houthis in Yemen, in this axis of resistance against the genocidal policies of the Zionists and the Israeli government, supported by the United States. That's the reason for this conflict. And if we just understand that this is what is going on, everything becomes clear. That what the Israelis have been seeking to do for 80 years is the elimination of the Palestinian people from Eretz Israel. I've spoken about this many, many times. We don't need to review that except to say that it has been consistent and it is now coming into its final form. It's now entering into the final solution, shall we say, as the 2 million Palestinians are now crowded, starved, forced into southern Gaza. And at a certain moment, Israel will punch through the border with Egypt and force them into the deserts of the Sinai. That's the plan. And then pave Gaza like they did in 1947, 48, when they expelled the 750 Palestinians, 50,000 Palestinians. They destroyed 350 Palestinian villages, razed them to the ground, and then built the Israeli Jewish settlements or cities or towns. But they completely leveled the Palestinian villages. They've done it time and time again, and we're watching them do it now in Gaza and the West Bank. And it has been Iran that has consistently stood against this and supported the resistance as best they've been able to do, given the adversity and the sanctions and the maneuverings of the United States and Israel against them. It's very important to note as we think about the final solution, as we think about what has brought us now to the brink of war against Iran to completely take them out. What the Netanyahu government has done since October 7th. They've wiped out Gaza, completely destroyed Gaza in every sense of that term. And now they're starving 2 million people and forcing them into such squalid conditions that when they punch through the border, there will be relief that at least they're not going to be shot at on the other side. And this was the tactic, just to recall, that the Germans used against the Jews in the Second World War over and over again. The Warsaw Ghetto is a classic example. The Jews were huddled into unbelievably crowded quarters. They were essentially starved to death. And then the Germans came and said, anybody want to leave? They gave them a crust of bread, put them on trains, and took them to the concentration camps. There was crowded trains because the Jews didn't think that anything could be worse than what they were enduring in the Warsaw Ghetto. And they went to their doom. So that playbook has been used before. We all need to understand that's what's happening now. Since October 7th, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but against Hezbollah, against the Houthis, against Syria, the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria, uh, uh, other activities. The Israelis, supported by the United States, have been seeking full spectrum dominance, to completely crush any resistance to the full establishment of Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, free, ethnically cleansed of any Palestinians. The clarity that we need to hold is at an even deeper level than just simply what the Israelis are doing on the ground. What we're witnessing is essentially the collapse of the rules-based order. For centuries, countries around the world have sought to design international norms and procedures in and through which countries interact. There are even protocols for how you conduct war and how one side communicates with the other through parlays or third back channels or notifications. There's been time honored understanding that you don't attack the embassies of other countries, that that's a diplomatic necessity, that even in war, embassies need to function so that diplomacy always has an opportunity to be effectuated in a deliberate and reasoned manner. That's the international rule of law. That's what has been referred to as a law-based system. And that is what has been completely broken down by what the United States and Israel have been doing in the Middle East. There are no red lines, either legally, morally, politically, or militarily. They've engaged in relentless assassinations. They've bombed the Iranian embassies in various cities. They have engaged in a relentless campaign without any concern for international protocols or international law. What the Israelis did to Greta Thunberg and the flotilla several weeks ago was a violation of international law. It is against international law for any country to seize another vessel on the high seas if that vessel comes within the coast. There may be justification. But all around the world, shipping operates on the assumption that there's free shipping to any port in the world. And that is a violation of a rules-based order for one country to go into international waters and seize a boat, arrest everybody, take them back to Israel, destroy the boat. That was barely mentioned in the press because the violation of this rules-based system has been so egregiously effectuated that the only thing that is left is just to stand back and watch what's happening and understand that any notion that the United States or Israel have about them being moral countries representing the light in a dark world, democracy in the midst of totalitarianism, human rights, social justice. That veneer has been stripped away in the world public perception of both Israel and the United States. And this is an extraordinary thing to take in. And I want to dwell on it just for a moment or two, because the gravity of this is both shocking, and the implications of this will reverberate around the world from now on. The United States was built with a vision articulated in our constitutional system of human rights, of liberty, of fraternity, of equality for everyone. Everyone has the right for happiness, liberty in a democratic system. That's what the United States stood for over 2 centuries, and people flocked to our shores. That's why people went to Israel. Israel was a beacon of democracy and a sea of authoritarianism. And there was the notion that the Israelis held themselves to a higher moral code than the Arabs did. All that has been shattered irrevocably. And the emperor has been revealed to have no clothes. And that shift of gestalt about how Israel and the United States perceives itself and how the world perceives the United States and Israel is an extraordinary transposition of values that will initiate a cascade of unintended consequences into the future. One of the most fundamental of which is that world Jewry, Israel, can no longer refer to the Holocaust in any kind of meaningful way. Because now in the public mind, the Holocaust in Germany and the Holocaust in Gaza are inseparably linked. That the people who endured Holocaust are now effectuating a Holocaust. And the damage that that is going to do on the public perception of Israel and Judaism can't even be calculated. As Gabor Mate, the great psychologist and specialist in trauma, has said repeatedly, we're witnessing one of the greatest crimes in the history of Judaism. And it's shattering the respect that the world has built up over several millennia about Judaism. So the gravity of what's taking place, not only in Gaza, but now in Iran, is extraordinary. That's why I've repeatedly have said, this is the crime of crimes. It's not simply genocide. It is the shattering of a worldview. It's a shattering of an entire religious tradition and how it's viewed by the rest of the world. And yet, the momentum toward full-scale war continues. It's an amazing moment that we're living through at this time. Now, I want to take a few minutes also to talk about Iran, because there's so much misinformation about Iran that, like with Russia, like with Vietnam during the Vietnamese War, like with Iraq during the Gulf War in the early 2000s, what is necessary for the war is to create a caricature and a demonic figure on the other side. And that has probably been done more completely about Iran than maybe any other country on earth. So I want to just take a few minutes to offer an alternative view of one of the great civilizations in history. Because I think if we take the time to go behind the caricatures and humanize the people that we are now mobilizing to decapitate, it will enable us to see more clearly that the enemy formation that is being carefully architected and created on the mainstream media is actually a fraud. And the reality, as it almost always is in propaganda, is the opposite of what we're being told. So let me start, and I'm just going to give you a very quick history of Iran. The word Iran is a Persian word that means the land of the Aryans. It was into Persia that the tribe of Aryans coming out of the Caspian and Eastern European and Russian regions took place probably 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, maybe more. They went on into India, but they really settled in what is now Iran. In the 6th century BC, so about 2,600 years ago, 2,700 years ago, there arose the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, where there were two peoples, the Medes and the Persians, came together under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. And he built the Persian Empire in the 6th century that spanned from India to the east, the Caucasus and Russia to the north, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to the south, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It was the first great empire. It's been called by many historians the greatest of empires, because Cyrus the Great and his followers on the throne created an imperial system that was essentially benign in the way that it maintained power by empowering local elites to interact, obviously under the hegemony of the Persians, but in a very tolerant way. It was The Persians, as you may recall from your Bible stories, that when they conquered Babylon, which is the current Iraq, they allowed the Jewish people who had been in captivity for 70 years to go back to Palestine and set up what is called the Second Temple and have religious freedom. The hallmark of the Persians was religious tolerance, political tolerance. So the Greek city-states, they were free to exercise democracy, as many of them did. Others were autocrats. That was okay too. What was of concern to the Persians is that everyone interact in a semblance of egalitarianism. And it was the Persians, by the way, that were known in the ancient world for the most liberated attitude toward women. In fact, if you've read Herodotus's histories, the Greek historian of the 4th century BC, he describes the Persians as effeminate, that the women had as much power as the men. And there were examples of women in the Persian Navy or the Persian army who were generals, and the queens of Persia were considered personalities in their own right. So it was an extraordinarily elegant empire as far as empires go. And then you'll remember in about 330 or so BC, Alexander the Great, coming out of Macedon, burst into the Persian Empire. By then, 250 years old or so, heavily laden, very wealthy, quite corrupt, very benign, and therefore there was no way that the Persians could resist, the greatest military genius possibly in the history of the world. As with a small army, he decimated the Persian Empire and took it for Macedon. And that began this whole process of Hellenization. And there were a series of uh, successor states, successor empires, the Parthians, the Sassanids, various others. The Roman Empire rose up. So Persia was his own entity, but buffeted by world events. It had reached a particular point of weakness in the 7th century AD and became susceptible to invasion. And when Muhammad in the 7th century initiated the religion of Islam and the Arab armies took Islam out into the world, they overthrew the Persians and established hegemony over the entire Middle East, North Africa, all the way to Spain. And so the Persian culture was amalgamated into the Arab Muslim culture. And then in the 12th century, as you may remember from your histories, there was the Mongol invasion of Genghis Khan and his successors that very temporarily swept through Persia and conquered the land. It didn't last that long, and the Persians regained their independence and had a series of rulers, kingdoms, empires, all the way up to the 20th century. They resisted the Ottoman Empire, centralized in Turkey and Istanbul, and during the First World War, they began this process of gaining increased independence from the Western powers, from the Ottoman Empire. And in 1925, a military general seized control and established the Pahlavi dynasty, similar to what Ataturk created in Turkey at that time. Secular, democratic in principle, but authoritarian in practice. But it was what they called the Constitutional Revolution in 1925. And then, as world events emanating out of Europe with the rise of the Nazis and the mobilization for World War, uh, beginning in the late 1930s and 1940s, the Pahlavi dynasty sought to navigate through that thicket, keeping Iran essentially independent. And that then came into its own in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it's worth noting that the final conclave between Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, ending the Cold War, ending the Second World War, and the structure of the peace that they were going to impose after the unconditional surrender of Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific, was held in Tehran. And that's just a little historical footnote, but it's just worth knowing. And it was in Tehran that the post-war order was designed. And then in the aftermath of the war, Iran had a constitutional election and elected a man by the name of Mossadegh. And he was brilliant. He was compassionate in the spirit of Cyrus the Great and the Persians. He looked at the situation and the reality that the big oil company, the Anglo-American oil company, owned by the Americans and the British, controlled all the oil fields of Iran. And he said, this isn't right. This isn't just. So he began the process of trying to negotiate with the Americans and the British for some kind of nationalization where the Iranians would control the oil fields, the British and the Americans would operate them, take a percentage for profit, but the Iranians would essentially own the oil fields. And the Americans and the British said, no, that's not going to happen. We own them outright. We stole them fair and square. And that's the way it's going to be. And that gave rise to what is referred to by historians as the first post-war coup, 1953, where the United States and Britain contrived to overthrow the regime in Iran, the Mossadegh regime, to overthrow a constitutional democracy, to overthrow a regime that had emerged out of Iranian history and was doing everything it could for the general welfare of the Iranian people. Mossadegh was immensely popular. He was an elegant and erudite man who was only demanding that the Iranians control their own resources. And he was overthrown by the CIA and MI5 and killed. And they reinstituted the Shah, the Pahlavi Shah. And the Shah let the Americans and the British continue to pump the oil. And they then pumped him up and gave him military aid, economic aid. He became a great friend of Israel. He was a military dictator. He created a secret service called SAVAK, which was trained by the CIA. There were death squads. There was massive repression, all orchestrated by Washington and London to control the oil. And I would just say parenthetically that the United States and either Britain or the Mossad, Israel, it's always the same cast of characters, have overthrown over 100 countries in a similar way since the Second World War. So what happened to Iran is the way business is done to effectuate the American empire, which came out of the ashes of the British Empire at the end of the Second World War. Think about Chile in 1973, where Allende, popularly elected by the people of Chile, a democratic socialist who dedicated himself, as he was planning to do, to develop social welfare systems for the Chilean people. He also wanted to nationalize and make sure that the resources of Chile were for the Chileans. And President Nixon and Henry Kissinger overthrew him. He was shot. They brought in the Pinochet regime, which, like the Shah, engaged in relentless cruelty and repression and corruption and greed. What began to foment in Iran was what eventually came through the Ayatollah Khomeini, an elderly Shiite cleric who had been exiled and was living in France outside of Paris. And he began to make tapes, little tapes, little that you used back in there in the 70s. You had these little tape recorders, and you put these tapes in, as you may remember. He started to make these tapes, and there was a whole network, and they would take his tapes into Iran, and that began to mobilize rebellion against the Shah and against Savak. To finally, in early 1979, this was during the administration of Jimmy Carter, who was actively supporting the repression of the Shah and was hosting the Shah in Washington and, vaunting up the great Pahlavi dynasty as a true and eternal friend of Israel and the United States. And the Ayatollah Khomeini said, no, that's not what Iran should stand for. And eventually, millions of people turned out in the streets. There were so many Iranians that turned out in the streets in 1978 and 1979 that the Shah basically fled the country. And the Ayatollah returned from Paris to tumultuous reception, bringing in a unitary, theocratic, Shiite autocracy. What then happened which is very important in terms of what's happening now today, is you'll remember that in late 1979, I think it was in September of 1979, I don't remember exactly, a group of students spontaneously took over the US embassy in Tehran. And that began the hostage crisis that went on week after week after week. And there was this election going on between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And Carter tried to liberate them, and it was a complete military fiasco. And the Iranians shot the helicopters out of the sky, captured pilots, and that added insult to injury to the Americans. And it was like adrenaline to the Iranians. And it was an extraordinary event that destroyed the Carter presidency. And Ronald Reagan secretly negotiated with the Iranians to not release the hostages. So Carter would fall, Reagan would be elected. And if you remember, on the day Reagan was elected, the hostages were released. And then what did the Americans do? This is the perfidy of empire. It wasn't that Reagan wanted to be friends. He was just manipulating the situation. Because what proceeded to happen is the Americans decided they were going to take the Iranians out. And so they began to arm the strong man in Iraq, because Iraq is right to the west of Iran. And you have Afghanistan and you have India, but Iran is right there in the middle of the Middle East. They began to incite Saddam Hussein, giving him chemical and biological weapons and all kinds of military and strategic support to attack Iran, which he did using the chemical and biological weapons given to him by the United States. And for 8 years, the Iranians had to resist the US, British, Iraqi assault on Iran. They still wanted the oil fields back. And then, as you know, the Saddam Hussein, uh, after that was over, he had real challenges and his country was in disarray and he invaded Kuwait. And this was 1990s for the first Gulf War. And the United States under George Bush Sr., after supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran, now turned against Saddam Hussein and sought to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Extraordinary. The perfidy of empire. And all through this, the Iranians are trying simply to survive and implement an extraordinarily harsh regime in Iran, depriving women of any meaningful freedom or liberty, violating any semblance of human rights, as they were seeking to implement a Shiite autocracy on a people, 90 million people, 92 million people at latest count, who were essentially secular, who were essentially cosmopolitan. So the regime internally had its issues, but externally, Iran articulated support for the Palestinian people and for the rising up of the Muslims, the Arab peoples, against the supremacy of Israel in the Middle East. And it was in that context and out of that dialectic that Benjamin Netanyahu began to articulate his policy formation, that the only way for Israel to gain full spectrum dominance was to sow discord, chaos, dysfunction over the entire Middle East. And that's when he came with this proposal. Let's go after Iraq. Let's go after Afghanistan. Let's go after Lebanon, Syria, Somalia, Sudan. Let's wipe everybody out, destabilize the entire region, and then let's take out Iran. If we could just do that, Israel could finish off the Palestinians and establish the dominant state in the Middle East. That's been the game plan for the last 30 years of the neocons in the United States and the Zionists in Israel. And now they're coming together in the aftermath of October 7th to finish the job. That's what Netanyahu keeps saying. Let me conclude with just a few observations about the current situation and what to expect. Number one, like with the United States and Ukraine, all the kind of razzmatazz and hoopla about the supremacy of the Israeli military and intelligence, and they can establish complete superiority over Iran. They thought, you know, last week when they initiated the first attack and killed 20 IRGC commanders, killed 9 nuclear scientists, and a bunch of other people. They thought that was going to trigger regime change. It didn't happen. The Iranians recovered and hit back. And they've been hitting Israel back for the last week. And what is emerging is not only that the Israelis are not as strong as they've been telling everybody they are, and the Iranians are stronger than anybody expected. But to finish the job, Israel needs the United States. It can't do it on its own. And that's where Donald Trump comes in, who vaunted himself as the peace president in his inaugural address, and is now being boxed in by the Israeli government, the Zionist lobby in the United States, to go to a war to finish the job that I have a feeling he's deeply ambivalent about for 2 reasons. Number one, I think Donald Trump, in his own way, actually would like to solve the problem through diplomacy. As a businessman, I think his instincts are around diplomacy. And number two, I think that what he's observing in his MAGA base, Make America Great Again base, with Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and Marjorie Taylor Greene and many others, is a fracturing of his base around Iran. There's very little support among the American public. 70%, roughly 60, 70%, depending on the polls, are opposed to the war, whether you're Democrat or you're Republican. People don't want war. So he's boxed in. So as we're talking about it today, he's given himself within 2 weeks. You can imagine the pressure that's coming at him in the Oval Office from the neocons and from the Zionists, from the Israeli government. Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson were in the White House yesterday, pleading with him not to do this. Steve Bannon is perfectly clear, as is Tucker Carlson, of the parallels between what's happening now and what happened in Iraq. The United States was seduced into it by Netanyahu and the neocons, and it ended in a catastrophic failure. Similar in Afghanistan, similar in Syria, similar in Libya, just like what happened in Vietnam. And so that point of view is playing out in the president's inner circle. And how he decides will determine his fate, our fate, Iran's fate, Israel's fate. But in the end, like I did with Ukraine, I'd make a prediction. Remember, with Ukraine, I said three things. Russia's going to win. America's going to walk away. And the tragedy is that Ukraine will be destroyed. That's what's happened. And I would say, with the current situation, Iran will stand against whatever onslaught. Out of the confusion and the chaos and the carnage, eventually, the United States will walk away. And Israel will suffer immeasurable damage in ways that I can't calculate, but which will be meted out by the forces of history. It's one thing for Israel to take on Hezbollah or Hamas. They're non-state actors. They have no armies. They have no tanks. They have no air force. They have a few rifles. They have a few grenades. They fight as they can, as a guerrilla operation. It's one thing for the state of Israel, armed to the teeth by the United States, to take out Hezbollah or take out Hamas. It's another thing for Israel, even with the United States, to take out one of the largest countries in the world. I think Iran ranks 17th in terms of size in the world and 23rd in terms of the size of the economy, bolstered by alliances with Russia and China and Brazil and South Africa and the BRICS coalition that are supporting the Iranians against Israel and the United States. If Donald Trump decides to go in, my prediction is it'll end just as disastrously as it has for the United States in the last half a dozen wars it's instigated, most recently in Ukraine, but in the Middle East and in Asia. And so we need to pray. I would urge all of us to write our congressional representatives, our senators, make your views known. I don't believe intuitively that Trump has fully made up his mind. I think he's dithering. He knows what's at stake. And what will tip the balances, who knows? But we're in one of those moments as between the oblation and the sacrifice, between the plan and the deed. And so I would urge all of us as we close today to just understand the fragility of the psyche of the American president. And I think pray that in the end, he holds back and that the Iranians will hold back and the Israelis are kept back from the crucible of regional war. So thank you, everyone, for this session today as we've pondered the complexities of Iran. Uh, Next week, we're going to be turning to the environment and to regeneration of the environment through the Gaia Education partnership that we've been cultivating here at Ubiquity University. But today it felt prudent, given what's at stake for the world, to ponder the situation as it's unfolding in the Middle East. And the world will be a much different place by next Friday when we meet again. And we will take note of unfolding events at that time as we do week by week for Humanity Rising. So thank you, everyone. I will join the after chat for a bit. You will see the link in the chat box. You also receive the link in your Zoom reminders for today. Bye for now, and we'll see you next week here for Humanity Rising as we seek to connect the dots in world affairs.